Happy Easter, everyone.
Happy Easter.
Good to be with you here today. And, we look at the resurrection of Jesus and say, hey, we celebrate this day in history, but is it rational to believe that the resurrection actually occurred? We live in the 21st century where we have electric lights, we've got toasters, we've got television, we even have electric drum sets. Can we really believe something as radical as Jesus rose from the dead? And it just seems so alien to the typical things that we experience in life. I mean, I don't know anyone who's been raised from the dead. Don't see these kinds of things. So we're not here to talk about the evidence for the resurrection. That's something I talked a little about this morning, and something I've written several books on. But Chuck has asked me to talk this evening about the real Jesus. And what can we know about Jesus? And there's a lot of talk that goes around. Most people would reject the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. They'd say it never happened. And occasionally you see all these different things come up about, scholars are discovering what the real Jesus was actually like. A few years ago we had the Da Vinci Code come out, and the Da Vinci Code had all these kind of bizarre things about Jesus and things that said about him. He was married to Mary Magdalene. They had children. Nobody ever thought of Jesus as God until it was voted on by the Emperor Constantine. He was the first to bring it up. And Constantine and the Council of Nicaea chose all the books of the Bible or the New Testament and put in there, and all the rest of them they banished and burned. Burn them all. And so what can we know about the real Jesus? And every couple of years you'll find some kind of a new hypothesis that comes up that challenges the traditional view of Jesus, the Jesus that we see in the New Testament. Well, what's really interesting is for years, evangelical biblical scholars have noted that at Bible college and seminaries, that the average biblical knowledge of a student is dropping. And so when students come to, say, seminary or Bible school to do a biblical degree, their knowledge was maybe here 10, 20 years ago, but now they start here. It's almost being biblically illiterate. What's interesting, though, it's not just evangelical or conservative biblical scholars who are saying this. You even have some very skeptical scholars, like Mark Ehrman, who refers to himself as a happy agnostic. He is a biblical scholar that teaches at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And he made a statement recently that said that he noticed that the knowledge of Bible students is way below what it used to be. And he said one time in class, he asked a question just for the fun of it. He says, can anyone tell me what language the Bible, the New Testament, was written in? And most of the students in the class, he said about half the students in the class said Hebrew. And this is in a Bible class. And the other half said English. And for those of you who are wondering, it's Greek. So the biblical knowledge, the average biblical knowledge and literacy of students is way down. And even Dale Martin, a rather skeptical guy at Yale, says the same thing. Well, when the biblical illiteracy has been growing so much, so that we're really starting at a low level. And hey, let me just add one other thing. I've spoken on more than 50 college campuses. And I can tell you that even at Baptist collegiate ministries, you would think that since Baptists pride themselves in the inerrancy of the Bible, and they believe that the Bible is the Word of God, that you would think that they'd be studying it and teaching it a lot. Well, maybe they are studying it, but by the time I talk to these college students, many of them are very biblically illiterate. They just don't know much about the Bible at all. So when you're confused and all these things, you don't know much about the Bible, you don't know much about what it says about Jesus, how do you distinguish between the real Jesus and counterfeits? When these bizarre views like the Da Vinci Code comes around, how do you tell what's true and what isn't? And so this evening what I want to do is I want to talk about the real Jesus. Who is the real Jesus? I want to talk about the history, the hogwash, and the hot air. Now, what we're going to do, I got this thing. What I want to say to you this evening is that we all can learn to distinguish between the real Jesus and counterfeits by understanding the 3 R's of doing good history. Now, we've all heard about the 3 R's of a fundamental education: reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? Well, tonight we're going to talk about the 3 R's of doing good history. And in order to be a responsible student of history, let's look at these 3 R's. The first is relevant sources. Now, anything that we study in the past, anything, if we're going to determine something like, did Julius Caesar cross the Rubicon River in 49 BC? The first thing we would want to do is we would want to look at all the relevant sources. Now, it wouldn't matter what was in a source that was written 1,000 years later, or 1,500 years later, or maybe even 500 years later. We want to know the sources that are written closest to the purported event itself. Are there any sources that are saying these things? And so we would want to do that with Jesus as well. If we want to find out about who Jesus was really like, what he was really like, we want to find out the relevant sources. What sources mention him? So, for example, just about Jesus, you've got the letters of Paul. And Paul's writing those letters between 50 and 65, maybe even a little bit before 50, like 1 Thessalonians, somewhere between, and maybe even Galatians, somewhere between 45, a little bit later. So I could probably adjust that date back to 45. And then you have the New Testament Gospels. Most scholars agree that Mark was the first one. They differ on when Mark was written, but most scholars would agree these Gospels were written between the years 50 and 100, so within a 50-year period. Josephus was a Jewish historian. He did not become a Christian. Josephus was born 7 years after Jesus' death on the cross. And he hated the Romans. He grew up in a Jewish family. His father's name was Matthias, and he was a very popular Jewish priest in Jerusalem. So this places Josephus in Jerusalem, geographically the very place where Christianity started and is exploding. And it places him chronologically when he would have heard the apostles preach. And then maybe you think, well, yeah, but maybe he wasn't interested in religious things. No, he was. Because by the time he got into his early 20s, he became a Pharisee and a Jewish priest himself. So since he's growing up in Jerusalem at this time, we know that Josephus was interested in religious things. Imagine sitting around the dinner table at the Josephus family and listening, talking about the debates. Hey, a certain number of my colleagues, the priests, had converted to Christianity. They are now Christians, and they say Jesus was the Messiah. Well, they're saying that we don't have to follow all the Jewish law anymore, and so you have all these kinds of debates, kind of like we have today with things like, should women be allowed to be senior pastors, or the gifts of the Spirit for today, and what about Calvinism and election and predestination and all this. You go over and you have all these different kinds of debates within the church, and so they were debating these kinds of things probably within Josephus' family of who were these Christians, and can they be Jews, or are they heretics? Now, Josephus hates the Romans, and he ends up being a general in the rebels who fight against the Romans, and he gets defeated by the Romans. And then he joins the Romans, and he gets the favor of a Roman emperor named Vespasian, who ends up employing Josephus as a court historian. And Josephus writes things, and he mentions Jesus on 2 occasions. There's a guy named Tacitus who is regarded as the best of all the Roman historians. He was a governor of what is Asia today, and a very good and accurate historian, although not a perfect historian. And he mentions Jesus in his Annals of Rome. And then you have what are called the Apostolic Fathers. Now, these aren't the apostles, as the name would seem to suggest, but these were the leaders of the church after the apostles. So really, you should call them the post-apostolic fathers, is what it should be. But that's what they've been called, the Apostolic Fathers. Some of these were actually disciples of the apostles themselves. People like Clement of Rome, who was a disciple of Peter, Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. And then you have others like Ignatius and Papias, and there are other writings as well. These all belong to the Apostolic Fathers, and they mention Jesus. And of course, of particular interest would be someone like Polycarp and Clement and Papias, because they probably knew the apostles. And so it's interesting what they have to say about Jesus.